There's a time in our nation's history where Hitler commended the United States for our work in eugenics. He even wrote a fan letter to a eugenics leader here in the United States. That's hard to believe, at least for me it was. It's even harder to believe, though, that the United States may have very well inspired the rise of Nazi Germany. I think it's fair to say that every country around the world has played some part in our history that they are not particularly proud of. Eugenics falls into that category. Eugenics is a touchy topic to discuss. I understand that. I also understand that a lot of people don't even know what eugenics are. In the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss just how important it is to know this aspect of our history, how it's affected our country as well as others, and the overall historical background of the topic. So what are eugenics and where did eugenics originate? Eugenics was a movement where the sole goal was to improve the genetic makeup of the human race. This was done through forced sterilization. Eugenics date back to ancient times with Plato, writing about a society that strives to improve human beings through selective breeding. However, the term eugenics did not originate until 1883 by a man named Francis Galton. The term actually translates to well-born, and Francis Galton was influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest, helped advance eugenics into serious scientific study in the late 1900s. By World War I, eugenics had a full support of many scientific authorities and political leaders, including President Theodore Roosevelt. However, once Adolf Hitler and his Nazi followers started using concepts of eugenics to support the extermination of entire races, eugenics lost support and quickly failed as a science. It's well known that Hitler and his followers were not the only ones to experiment with eugenics. In fact, there were many countries that were participating in the so-called science well before Hitler's time. Eugenics was an influence in North America, Latin America, Japan, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, ancient Greece and Rome, Nazi Germany obviously, and many other countries. Government policy, though, concerning eugenics varied from country to country. For example, in New Zealand, people who were deemed undesirable were rounded up and placed into communities specifically designed for them. The official term for these communities were psychopathic hospitals. I think that's how you pronounce it. These people were treated like animals, quite literally. There's cases that you can read about where they were forced into kennels as a form of discipline. They weren't allowed an education. They never learned to read or write, and they were instead forced into labor on farmland and gardens and laundromats. They were forced to clean other members of this community that couldn't take care of themselves. And once they were put in these communities, they could not leave. They were isolated. And the reason why they were isolated is so they couldn't procreate. They didn't want people who were deemed undesirable to reproduce or to have offspring. And they did this to diminish the number of undesirables. There were 4 to 5 of these communities total, and the last community was shut down in the late 90s. The late 90s, that was not that long ago. So we understand how it's affected other countries, but what about our country specifically? Focusing on just the United States, we know that the eugenics movement began in the late 19th century, and our country's focus, just like all the other countries, was to stop the transmission of negative or, once again, undesirable traits from generation to generation. The difference between our country and New Zealand is that we surgically sterilized people without their consent, whereas New Zealand isolated people without their consent. Both concepts end in the ending of bloodlines. That was the whole point of all of it. The United States kind of took it a step further, though. They established sterilization programs as a solution to, once again, diminish the number of undesirables. And these programs were put in place in a total of 33 states. They were targeted toward mentally ill people in the beginning, but that expanded further out shortly after, towards people who exhibited traits of alcoholism, criminality, chronic poverty, blindness, deafness, feeble-mindedness, promiscuity, and, this is an obvious one, race. Given the time frame that this happened in, there were many African American women who were forcibly sterilized during this time. In total, there were around 65,000 Americans that were sterilized during this time, and this occurred from 1900s into the 1940s. There are some cases that you can read about that occurred up into the 60s. The only difference between those two time frames, though, is that in the 40 years that we have here in the beginning, it was an open concept. It was supported by so many people, and I read the other day that it was a topic that was discussed at the dinner table with your family. But then Hitler came into the picture, and it suddenly became shameful of us to have been doing this. And now this man is, killing thousands of people. So up into the 60s, from then on out, it was done in secret because Americans were ashamed of it. So I know that what's been discussed thus far hasn't been too optimistic. But the good thing is that most of the countries that were participating in eugenics are now trying to heal the results of what's happened in the past. So we talked about New Zealand earlier. New Zealand has now begun to mend their mental health system, and that is such an awesome thing. It's such a giant leap forward because mental health has never been taken as seriously as it should. So for that country to be mending their mental health system is such a giant leap forward. America has since abolished laws pertaining to eugenics and have distributed written letters of apologies to people affected throughout history. Of course, there's no apology or compensation in this world that can take back the atrocities and shame that eugenics have brought to people all around the world. What matters, though, is that officials in the past couple of years have been trying to mend what officials in the past have broken. I believe that as human beings, we live and learn from our mistakes, and all we can do is be better for future generations. And that does not mean define each person as desirable and undesirable. It means accepting and loving your neighbor as they are. And we are on the right path in doing that. Thank you.